dangers of ignorance, of self-interest. It's the sign of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without agreeing with it.
So, what is philosophy, and how does it kind of help us with our lives?
So philosophers love to debate things, and there's debate even about the very nature of philosophy itself. One common definition, it's an investigation into how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. So I think people who go with that definition, they think about philosophy has three traditional branches: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. First one is about the nature of what exists, not in a passing or contingent way, but like in a deeper way. So like whether God exists, that's a metaphysical question.
Mm,
Epistemology is philosophy as it investigates how we can know things and questions related to the nature of knowledge itself. And then ethics, of course, is the branch of philosophy that concerns moral judgment and action. And I tend to think of philosophy, I think, especially if you're into metaphysics, that approach, I think, gets, at what you're interested in. But I tend to think of maybe philosophy in perhaps a slightly more humbler way as the study and practice of arguments. So, areas where we want to get at the truth, we want to know what the truth of something is, but the truth in question is not one that can be arrived at through purely empirical or mathematical means, where we
mm,
have to involve some level of judgment and trying to have a well-grounded, well-supported basis for our judgment. So that's how I tend to think of philosophy. And then in terms of improving our lives, like I guess we're thinking right now, the kind of concrete, down to earth, practical ways. Am I
mm.
catching the spirit of your question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I would say it can help us. I mean, the way that comes to mind for me first is like in a negative way.
Mm,
Okay. So, like, just to use a personal example, um, until recently, I was a single guy, single middle aged guy, and I'd be on Instagram. The algorithm knows that I'm like a middle aged guy who, you know, uh, like I have to care about my appearance as a guy who goes on dates, right? So I'm bombarded with ads for like everything from like, the cure for baldness to like better skin to like you name it, right? And
yeah,
so if you were in my Instagram feed, you would think like for a mere 99.99, the fountain of youth could be delivered to my door, right? And now, this is maybe not shocking new information, but that's not really true, right? So I'm being bombarded with arguments in a sense that are appealing to, my self-interest, my vanity, things like that. And part of a benefit of philosophy, I think, is that it makes you a more critical analyst of arguments, not just from advertisers, but when election season is on, we're bombarded by our arguments of a political nature, religious arguments, all sorts of things.
mm,
And philosophy very much enhances our ability to kind of think critically about the enormous range of different kinds of arguments that we face all the time in those and other contexts. So that's kind of like a negative help, I think,
right,
right? Like a
yeah,
friend of mine once said when we were both philosophy students, we've been studying it for a couple of years, and he once said to me, like, one of the things he liked about philosophy is he felt it helped him, recognize BS. And I think that is part of its appeal. But in terms of like, I think a more positive benefit is that training yourself to think clearly and critically and to recognize the common fallacies, it can help you, I think, not just avoid falsehood, but it can enhance your ability to, I think, ultimately, um, get at the truth in terms of what your own ethics, your own politics, your own religion, your own economic views, all of that stuff. It can help you get there in a way that I think is ultimately more, not a guarantee of getting at the truth, but it enhances your ability to do so. And finally, I just think it instills a helpful kind of habit of mind.
mm,
I remember when I was young, before I had any exposure to philosophy or anything, just like anybody, I would get very attached to like what I thought was true and untrue. There's a famous sentence it's often apocryphally attributed to Aristotle. He didn't say it, but I kind of wish he did. What he says about an educated mind, I think, is especially true of an education that includes philosophy. It's the sign of an educated mind to be able to entertain an idea without agreeing with it. You
mm,
gain kind of a disinterested perspective on all sorts of things, including things that otherwise might make you quite emotional and in that way distort your judgment.
Wow. It's so I'm trying to like process that at the same time, but that's and so you talk about how it's arguing from both sides. Do you struggle coming to a conclusion at times because you want to keep arguing back and forth because you can see both sides? Like, this is the thing, like I think about a lawyer,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. That can be a vice, right? A
Hmm.
vice of going too far the other way. Now, I don't worry about that problem as much as I worry about being kind of too narrow and too committed. But I agree in principle that, um, ultimately on many of these issues, especially ones that do touch on practical matters, you ultimately do have to your feet have to touch earth somewhere and say, this is
Mm,
ultimately what I do think. I would say I don't struggle with that, I don't think. I have views that I'm very committed to, that my philosophical education has brought me to, and for me, where I think about aversion, I think of this question about my relationship to my own views and are they too weak, are they too soft? It's like when I'm grading student papers and I'm trying to ensure that if it's about something I have a well-developed view on, I
right.
wanna grade them in a way that is not just reducing the grade to agreement with me, right? So
Oh,
okay,
okay.
so but I'm trying to think, like, every once in a while, I think like anybody, there will be issues where I do find the arguments back and forth quite persuasive,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think I become more susceptible to that view as a result of my philosophical education.
Exactly. So one thing I love to talk about is what you brought up and how it's not becoming too narrow-minded when it comes to arguments because as we've seen, we can be too narrow-minded. It's like our way, the highway, or I read
Yeah,
this, so it has to be this way. How can someone play back and forth with an idea, whether they agree with it or not at first?
that's a good question. I mean, I'm trying, especially in my first year classes, I'm trying to instill students with this habit of mind. So one thing I'll do is I'll tell them that's what we're trying to do, right?
Mm,
And I think there's something about being in outside the regular spaces of your life, like being in the classroom, for example. That is a regular space in many people's lives, right? But it's deliberately a space where we can adopt like a detached perspective.
mm,
So if you can be in kind of contexts like that, the classroom, maybe a discussion group with friends, whatever, where it's not like we're like hashing out some big issue between us and like our boyfriend or girlfriend or our colleagues at work, but we have the freedom and the space to like explore it carefully in a disinterested way, that can help a lot. So a good way to practice this, right, is to start with issues where you don't feel immediately committed to a strong view one way or the other, right?
mm,
And try to train yourself on those kinds of issues. And so, um, deliberately trying to do so, and reminding ourselves of the many ways that the process of trying to reach a disinterested view can go wrong. Again, that's not a guarantee, but that can only help, right? So if we
mm,
remind ourselves in advance that there are dangers of ignorance, of self-interest, of being, upset by something that happened to us early in the day or whatever it is, I think those can be helpful. But ultimately, I think it's the practice, right? The practice of
mm.
trying to think about it and talk about it and write about it in a disinterested way. It doesn't come overnight, but over time, I think you can learn that skill.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, let's talk about ethics. What is applied ethics for people that don't know?
So, applied ethics is the branch of moral philosophy that tries to actually give us guidance on particular concrete issues. So, two very prominent domains within applied ethics would be biomedical ethics, or they're trying to like sketch out theories of what should actually happen, for example, in a medical context. So, what is the right way to think about the ethics of euthanasia, for example, or abortion? Those are very common
Mm,
in the bioethics subfield. And then environmental ethics is another paradigm example where we want to think about what obligations, if any, do we have when it comes to the environment, the animals within it, future generations who might have to live with our environmental decisions. So it's where the theory is still very present in doing work, but it's being applied to concrete issues that will require us to make actual decisions or at least arrive at a correct judgment about something down to earth.
okay, makes so I talked about this last week with another guest. Where does ethics come from? Is it like a nature versus nurture type thing? Is it something that we can be learned? Is it kind of like in us? From
Mm.
your what you've
Yeah.
seen.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I just taught a class on ethics where, something like this question came up. I mean, historically, a traditional answer here in, like, the Western world has been it's ultimately related to God or something like that, like, the will
Mm,
of a divine being.
mhm,
There are still philosophers who think that, I'm not one of them. Uh, so, this it's not like I think we found a non-controversial answer to this question, but the answer that I find most compelling or persuasive is one that I think we can see if we distinguish between that capacity that you and I and our listeners have recognize that something is like a moral claim or idea or reason, okay? So call that like our moral consciousness, right?
mhm,
That's like our ability to tell that if we're debating the ethics of euthanasia, there's something different going on there than if you and I are debating like our favorite food
mhm,
or, what would be in our self-interest, right? So the ability to recognize morality as a domain distinct from aesthetics, self-interest, things like that. I think that probably ultimately is innate. It can
okay,
go wrong, right? Like,
mhm,
and not everybody has it. I think psychopaths probably don't have that, which may be why so many psychopaths end up, in prison. But that consciousness of like that ability to recognize and engage in moral reasoning, I think that probably is innate. There's an analogy that a philosopher once made. If you think about the capacity of little children to learn language,
mhm,
obviously that's culturally influenced, right? Depending on where you
mm,
grow up, you will learn a different language, in China than you would if you grew up, right? But
right,
that there's a capacity there, right? And that
mhm,
capacity, again, with occasional exceptions, that seems universal in human beings. So I want to say like the capacity to engage in moral reasoning is a bit like that. It's innate. But then, what the actual concrete views that you and I have, that's obviously gonna be historically and culturally conditioned, okay? But so if we were born 500 years ago, we'd probably think very differently than we do now, right?
right,
But I think we also have the capacity to kind of stand back and evaluate particular views that we have, so views that we had 500 years ago around slavery and other stuff, the capacity to kind of think clearly and critically about our ethical commitments, that has influenced them. So if we think of the sheer capacity, I think that's innate. But the actual body of views that we have, I think that is the result of multiple factors, um, including. But it starts with that innate ability, and then our ability to think and reason and detach ourselves from our culture. That all plays a role.
and so are morals and ethics the same thing?
99 most of the time they are, yeah. So sometimes we'll talk about moral philosophy. Most of the time in my mind and when I'm reading, they're usually synonyms. Occasionally, moral philosophy can have a slightly larger meaning to include what is known as, like, moral psychology, like, what are the habits of mind that we actually draw on or display in addition to, like, the actual content of our ethical beliefs, but most of the time, morals and ethics just refer to the same thing.
So I've thought about this one question for a while, and I didn't write it down because I. What if two morals kind of conflict? So, for example, let's say you don't believe in violence, you want to hurt anyone, but then the situation where you have to save someone else by hurting them.
Yeah.
Can that kind of conflict in the brain and at all?
So, are we talking about the conflict like 2 people have different views, or it's more like an inner conflict inside the same person?
Like an inner conflict in the same
Yeah,
person.
okay, great. Yeah, I mean, that who hasn't had that, like, that's a
Right.
very common experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there can be, like, ethical dilemmas where we feel kind of torn between 2 strong moral claims, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous play by Sophocles, Antigone, which is about that, right? Does she go with the claims of the government, or does she go with the claims of her family, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think that can happen, and
Mm-hmm.
then an obvious question is like, well, what should we
Do
do about that, right?
right.
And so, again, there's different ways to think about this, but my own view is, um, let's stipulate that these are 2 claims that we feel reasonably confident about, okay? So, like, they're not it's not like one of them is just some kind of passing idea that's just occurred to us, right? But, um in those kinds of cases, I think part of what we have to do is subject our entire body of ethical beliefs to like an internal consistency test. Okay. And the horn of the dilemma or the choice that we ultimately go with in these kinds of situations should be the one that is ultimately most in keeping with the other ethical beliefs we have about which we are most confident. Okay. So now that may sound a bit kind of vague and sketchy. So let me give you an example that I use in class when I'm talking
Yeah.
about this kind of issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's from this old movie from the 1980s. I don't know how well known it is. It's called The Lords of Discipline. And you don't really need to know very much about the movie, but it's set at a military academy like the Citadel in Virginia, those kinds of
Hmm.
places. Back in the early 60s, when the first so it's a black cadet shows up. Okay. So the drama of the movie is like they're kind of behind the times, right? And there's a lot of people who don't want him to succeed. Okay.
Right.
So there's one character who I think is fascinating because he embodies precisely what you're talking about, this idea of having, like, an ethical dilemma, okay?
Hmm.
So the character, he's like the sergeant major, so it's his job to, like, whip these young men into, like, officer material, right?
Mm.
Remember at one point, he describes having an ethical dilemma to another character, and it concerns his relationship with the black cadet, okay? So the one hand, he basically says, "I want this black student to fail," right? Because he's in the grip of, like, this kind
Racist.
of
Yeah.
racist view, and he feels that he grew up with that, right? He feels that
Hmm.
very strongly, right? But then he
Right.
also says, "But I take my job very seriously, and my job is to be the shepherd to my little lambs." That's what he calls the cadets of all of them, right? And so
Mm.
he's got this kind of like he's like, which way should I go, right? Should I
Hmm.
help him as his shepherd, or should I try to undermine him as basically like this like Southern racist? Okay.
Right.
And so you can imagine him going either way, right?
Hmm.
And whichever way he goes, he then has to render that decision consistent with his overall body of beliefs, right?
Right.
Suppose he goes the racist way, right?
Hmm.
So now he's kind of like embraced a principle, right? And it's like we can treat people in a second class way because of their race. Okay. So so now maybe he's faced with some question about how to treat women or some other group, right? Well, it seems like most consistent with this view is going to be it's okay to treat people second class and kind of their sex or feel in other
Right.
categories, right? And you keep going down that road, and it seems like at some point you just have to give up elements of morality that just seem very basic, right?
Hmm.
If somebody tried to treat me in a second class way based on my race or sex, I would protest, right? But
Right.
now that's out the window, right? On pain of consistency. Whereas if he goes the other way, it seems like he's taking on board an idea that is much easier to integrate into a recognizable moral system of the kind that we seem to be deeply attracted to. So the idea
Hmm.
that I have special obligations in my capacity as a teacher, right? That I believe that, right? And
Right.
so he's taking on board something that seems much more, you know, much easier to integrate into an overall moral system you could actually live with, you know?
Hmm. I think about this a lot when it comes to people who have like you said, a family that raised them one way, but
Yeah,
they don't want to be that way.
yeah,
What do they do? Because like at some point you still want to go home and see your family for
yeah,
Christmas, but you don't believe that. Whether it's political, whether it's
right,
sexual, whether
yeah,
it's whatever, you know?
yeah. I mean, so this issue, I think, comes in different degrees, right? So I know
Hmm.
some students I'm thinking of gay students I've had who've been raised by parents who don't, support them at the level of their sexuality at all, right?
Right.
And then I think a milder version is like, okay, now I gotta go home and I gotta listen to my dad talk about political views that I don't
Right.
agree with, but he's not really like saying mean stuff about me at the level of my very
Hmm.
identity, right?
Right.
Um, I mean, if we start with the smaller scale version of the problem, right? You know, you know, I think we all have relatives who are kind of like a mixed bag, right? And
Hmm.
maybe they have views we disagree with, maybe even some views we disagree with strongly, but we see other positive things about them and we even love them, right?
Hmm.
I think in those kinds of cases, there is some value in, not prioritizing the disagreement, of trying to find the common ground, occasionally biting
Mm.
one's tongue, right? But it's not an area I think where we can set up an algorithm, right? Where we can always know in advance, right? Because like maybe it starts to veer into like a more intense version of this problem, like I was just describing, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes, I mean, this is very painful, it's very difficult, right? But sometimes we actually have to like confront the people we love, right?
Right.
So I think it's going to be sensitive to that scope issue, but I don't know about you, but for me, like I find value certainly when I look back at my friendships, right? I
Mm.
have had friends I certainly disagree with politically, right? And I can see political views that I wouldn't want to see in a friend, right? There's some
Hmm.
extreme ones out there, right?
Right.
But like, like Democrat versus Republican, right? Like in my life, I've had friends who I really, really care about, even though we have like, medium-sized political disagreements at that level,
Mm,
And I think so this is maybe kind of a boring, wishy-washy answer, but we guess we need sort of like a kind of a Goldilocks view
mm.
where we don't just let people, run roughshod over us and like deeply respect us and violate our basic sense of decency and self-respect. But we don't go so far the other way where we make any kind of personal relationship contingent upon really, coming down really close to us on like partisan political questions that, lots of people disagree on. So that's my kind of boring middle of the road answer, I guess.
I think it's a good one. That's where I typically lean because
Yeah.
I am very much like, hey, we don't have to go crazy on either side, and everything we do, like we don't have to always focus on the negative. I think is
Yeah,
something that
yeah,
that's even the point of this podcast, to not focus on the negative and
yeah,
try and find positive things that come out of it.
yeah.
And leading into that, are you happy? Like I feel like so many times you see smart, like super super smart people or academic people, they seem more depressed because they're so smart. So I wonder that.
So I personally do feel I'm happy right now. To
Hmm.
be honest though, if I wasn't, I don't know if I would admit it in a podcast, but
True.
like,
Good
um,
point.
um, so I mean, I have it's hard to generalize, but I think I know the type of person you're talking about. I don't know how
Yes.
prevalent they are, but like I have
Mm,
met this type of person, right? Where like they do have this kind of critical consciousness, right? Like they're very good at like criticizing and analyzing, taking things apart. And there are people who they, as it were, they like turn that critical capacity on themselves, right?
right.
And that can be kind of debilitating in some ways, right?
Mm,
So so that kind of personality is they are out there. Okay.
yeah.
Now it's unfortunate though. It's unless we know them like before they got really academically educated, it's not clear to
Mm,
me how much of like a helpful basis of comparison we have because you can also see people who are just trapped in misery precisely because of their lack of an education. But I mean, I think people would not stick around academia as much as they do and not try to get into academia as much as they do if it were more obviously a path to misery, if it was obviously a path to
right.
misery, right? Like, both my parents were lawyers, right? And
Mm,
there's a lot of, like, imagery in our culture about the lawyer's path also being kind of miserable, but for different
yeah.
reasons, right? But
Mm,
they managed to carve out basically happy lives. And when I look back at my life, I don't think, and I am speaking honestly now, I
yeah.
don't think that going into academia made me less happy.
I wonder that because from a business perspective, you see a lot of people that are what blesses them professionally curses them personally. So like a business
Like, what
person, like
will be an example?
so like for example, let's say I'm making these right for what happened recently at Brown, right? These
Oh,
flyers.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. And so let's just say it wasn't for this flyer, but let's just say it was for a branding for a cup, right? And an entrepreneur is making it. Well, this star could be a little bit out of view. Let's just say it's not, but let's say it is, and they obsess over it, and they obsess over it all
Oh,
the time. This
oh, yeah.
obsession, because they notice it, makes it perfect. But in their life, obsessing over the tiniest flaw can ruin
Mm,
a marriage, can
mm.
ruin a friendship, can
Yes,
ruin
yes,
whatever.
yes.
So I kind of wonder if that over like what you said, like a lawyer's job is to overanalyze into different things. Or they
Yeah,
bring that home, that same obsession, that same whatever that blesses them professionally, that makes them the
yeah,
money,
yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
kind of curses them personally.
That's okay, I see what you mean. So yeah, so that kind of like attention to detail, that's like a
Mm,
nice example, right?
mm,
So I have met people, not necessarily academics, but people in general who are very kind of capable and organized and attentive to detail, and that can help them in their workplace. But in the spirit of what you're saying, in my experience, it can sometimes make them like difficult. It's like they become sort of micromanagers in their relationships outside of work, which I think is maybe part of what you're kind of getting at. Yeah, so I think that's a real kind of phenomenon, especially, like especially if it's something that's working for you, like in the work world, you know what I
mm,
mean? Like,
yeah,
and so there's an old saying about lawyers, they're kind of trained to be bad managers because a lawyer, especially a litigator, they have to be adversarial in the courtroom, but there are many contexts in which
right.
adversary, being somebody's adversary is not the right kind of move. If we
Mm,
bring it back to academia, like I haven't seen every corner of academia, but the corner of it that I'm in, something I really like about academics in general, and again, there's always exceptions, but compared to other lines of work, most academics in my experience, they're not that materialistic. They're interested in like ideas and like other, and explaining stuff and stuff like
Mm,
that. And I think that um can be helpful in terms of like not sweating the small stuff, not getting but not getting consumed by money and status and things like that. And that can actually be a positive, including I think of the way you're talking about where um we don't, again, there's lots of exceptions, but like I think I remember reading empirical studies of people who do have very materialistic values, and it's like, if that's your value set, like, it's very easy to get disappointed, right? Like, you always want something new or shiny or better, right? And so when you have a kind of a when you reinforce different sides of yourself, I think that can kind of, like, help, for lack of a better term, that can help kind of chill a person out and make them less stressful to be around.
that makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you, because my thought was the other way around. I always, because you know how you view something from the outside, from your tiny experience, and then you're like, oh, that's probably what it is. Thank you. That makes more sense.
Okay, good.
So, like, one thing I always kind of wonder about, how do you teach? Because I want to talk about a little bit how people can kind of get into their life philosophy and kind of like get interested into it. One, how can people learn it on their own? Maybe they're not in school or whatever. They just want to kind of learn it.
Mm,
And two,
mm.
how do you teach philosophy? Like, what does that kind of look like?
So, I I interact with a lot of people who are not philosophers, right? And often they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I don't know much about it except I read a book by so and so," right? And so, you know, these days it's helpful to think of philosophy as kind of like a specialized field, right? So, there are books that talk about, especially about the history of philosophy from like ancient Greece till now. So they'll talk about like the big thinkers, their big kind of abstract theories. And some people who are not in academia are very interested in that, right?
Mm,
There's a lot of philosophy that's more kind of like it's more like focused, right? So there's like stuff about like the philosophy of science. What is consciousness? Like how does it fit into the universe that we think of mainly as like a physical universe?
hmm.
Uh so the philosophy of mind and political philosophy, which I love, right? So there's a lot of philosophy actually, I think, already present in a lot of different areas. Like, scientists will often have to, like, invoke concepts carefully, like, what is a species, right? Like, there's a lot of kind of, like, conceptual work done in science, politics, the economics, other areas, and so I think some people are already kinda more into philosophy than they may realize. But if they're
Interesting.
interested in that kind of very general overarching sense of philosophy, like the theories, that cover everything, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, then reading, like a book like, Bertrand Russell has this very famous history of philosophy. There's a podcast series now, A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, where, like a lot of histories of philosophy, they'll skip over the Middle Ages, but he not only does the Middle Ages, he does like non-European philosophy, including Asian and African and other ones. So there's podcasts you can listen to. If any of those get somebody's brain, waves firing, they can usually follow it up with reading books that maybe are written by the guests or they mention in the podcast.
Mm.
So in addition to like general histories, podcasts, how do I teach it? Well, it depends on what the topic is. Okay. So, um, so in this class, I just taught intro to philosophy ethics. There's different ways to do that, but what I do is I do it organized by I do 3 areas. So one is applied ethics. We have a few weeks in applied ethics at the end of the class.
Hmm.
So in that one, we're like, do animals have rights? That's like an applied ethics question, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
That's one of them. We do a couple other questions, but an easy one to understand. Then we also do what we sometimes call normative ethics, which means like a theory that tries to tell you the nature of moral truth in general and provide some guidance, even though it's not yet applied. So like,
Hmm.
here's a classic normative theory: utilitarianism. If you're a utilitarian, you believe that the best moral outcome is the one that maximizes happiness. Okay. So you're very concerned with what happens out there in the world, right? And give me two courses of action the one that maximizes happiness is going to be the better one, right? So you could imagine a utilitarian environmental ethic, right? Where we take it, we apply it to like environmental problems, right? So at that point, you would then have an applied ethic, right? But before you do that, you're just telling me kind of the basis of moral thinking, right? And so I do a couple weeks on that. There's other ones that are far less concerned with what happens out there in the world. The great rival would be deontology, that is much more concerned with the attitude of the person engaging in the action. So it's like, am I respecting you as my rational being, and you have your own goals and your own purposes? And am I avoiding the cardinal sin of reducing you to be just a mere means or instrument or tool of what my goals are? That's very different, right? That's like, so even if like using you could somehow maximize happiness, the
Mhm.
deontologist would say no, it's still wrong, right? And then we start off with a few weeks on what's sometimes called meta ethics, which are even more removed in a sense from the applied stuff, and they're trying to explain to us not immediately the correct way to think about moral frameworks in general, but kind of broader claims about the nature of morality. For example, is morality ultimately grounded in the will of God, right? You and I, we might, let's say you and I agree hypothetically on that, right? We could still have, and people who agree on that, they still do have moral disagreements about euthanasia and lots of other stuff, right?
Mm.
But and also, like, sometimes people disagree at that level, but they'll agree on the practical level, right? So I don't wanna say that there's no connection, because I think the stuff you think at the metaethical level, I think it has some relationship, right? But it's not so simple that, like, once we sort out the nature of morality on the metaethical level, all of our practical views immediately follow. They're ultimately separate. Another medical question would be like, is the truth of morality, not in terms of what people actually believe, but is the truth of morality ultimately culturally relative? So, for example, could it ever be okay for you or I to find ourselves in a culture that we didn't grow up in? You know, we're basically tourists here. Could we criticize some practice that is deeply entrenched in that foreign culture in a way that is legitimate, that is not just us imposing our alien cultural values on a context where they don't belong? So, like the example we discussed in my class is female genital mutilation, which I'm sure you've heard of, right?
Mhm.
So, so that also, right? So, like that issue, right? FGM, that's super applied, right?
Mhm.
But there's a more abstract question, which is moral truth itself ultimately culturally relative? And that's a question about the nature of morality, first and foremost, and
Mhm.
it'll have ramifications for what we should do and say practically, but it's not immediately a practical question. It's metaethical. So I start with a few weeks on different metaethical theories, relativism, divine command theory, a few weeks on normative theories, utilitarianism, deontology, and then a few weeks on applied ethics, animal rights, what obligations we might have in terms of giving to charities, uh,
Mm.
stuff like that. So the students get a sense of the different levels of abstraction at which moral questions can present themselves, and try to cover the waterfront that way, if you will.
Wow. Okay. So you made me think of two things. One, what's something you wish you could add to your classes, like it's maybe not in like the like your study like your curriculum in the curriculum, and also, do men and women differ when it kind of comes to moral philosophy and ethics that you noticed?
Okay, so the second one is, it's something that just came up in this class that I'm teaching, where this famous philosopher, her name is Martha Nussbaum. She's a contemporary philosopher I have a lot of respect for. So she's writing about one of the most well-known philosophers in the history of the Western tradition, John Stuart Mill. So Mill was a utilitarian. He wrote a very famous book called On Liberty, and he also wrote this book called The Subjection of Women. So he's writing in the 19th century, and he's saying a lot of stuff. Not every point he makes, I think, is amenable to us today, but a lot of it is just very common sense now, where he's saying there's a deep injustice in how men and women, how women are kind of kept down by men here in the 19th century, and husbands basically own their wives and all that stuff, right? So, so Nussbaum is writing about to what degree Mill agrees with different modern strands of feminism. Okay. And there is a strand that is very sympathetic to what you just said, that says, yes, not only do men and women differ, but they differ in a way that is quite noticeable and distinct. So this sub tradition within feminism is sometimes called difference feminism. And it says, typically, again, there's always going to be exceptions, right? But
Mhm.
typically, men approach ethical decision making through the use of abstract concepts like justice and fairness, whereas women are much more in concern with relationships, in particular, relationships of care to particular people. Okay.
Mhm.
So Nussbaum comes along and she's like, you know, not only does Mill have nothing in common with this view is basically is deeply flawed. Okay. So so, to what degree some kinds of differences between men and women, to what degree might those be explained by nature versus nature? Okay. I don't, that's a big debate that's been going on for a long
Right.
time. I think again, I have kind of like a middle of the road view where like I think there's going to be elements of both. Historically, it's been very easy to exaggerate the natural
Mhm.
side, but here's one that comes to mind. Like when insurance companies are insuring younger drivers, young male drivers have long had to pay higher insurance premiums because they seem to have a much higher risk threshold, right? So if you ask me to explain that, I think there's good evidence that that's impartially a result of the fact that, boys and men mature more slowly than girls.
Mm.
Testosterone seems to play some kind of role, right? So I don't want to deny that there could ever be any kind of natural differences between men and women, but I'm kind of wary of conscious of like so many things have been attributed to that, right? Like, women, here we are in the 19th century, right? You know, um, if you tell a woman something shocking, she might faint, right? Now, oh, that's just her nature, right? There's been so much BS
Uh-huh.
like that, right?
Yeah.
Well, on the ethical stuff, I'm very skeptical of that view I just articulated, the difference feminist view. That's
Mhm.
difference feminists in the 1980s. They tried to support that view with empirical evidence, and their empirical evidence has been very strongly challenged and I would say discredited. So I'm reluctant to say right now that we have good evidence that men and women disagree or differ in terms of their approach to moral reasoning. That hasn't really been my experience. Maybe in some other ways, like my insurance example, but I think
Mhm.
to me that seems safer ground than the difference feminist stuff. The first part of what you asked, is there stuff that I wish that I could include? Yeah, I mean, so I'm on a quarter system, and just on a very pragmatic level, we have 10 weeks instead of 15 that we would have under a semester system. So I feel this a lot, not so much in my intro ethics class because, it's an intro class. I want to assign readings, but also leave a lot of time for discussion.
Mm.
But in other classes, in my political philosophy class, in my philosophy and literature class, I feel that impulse very much, right? Often do want to go into deeper discussions that just the brutal 10-week quarter system rules out, and that influences, for example, what kind of text I can assign, right? So very there's a reason that shorter books often get assigned more than longer ones, right? It's
Right.
just much more practical, especially for people like me on the quarter system.
Makes sense. Was there a student that challenged the way you thought that can kind of like it almost led you to change the way you believe something, like philosophy wise,
I
moral,
do learn from
ethically?
students, there's no question about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So especially when I'm doing the grading, like if I have a big class of TAs, they do the grading, but students will notice things, like you have 40 people, we get pretty good students, right? So you have like
Right.
40 of them going through a text, like they're going to see things that I haven't seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was teaching a class on international justice, right? And so there's lots of like different theories, okay? And so this theory is pretty controversial. Okay. So I'll mention it like I'm not pushing it, but I'll just
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
that like the open borders view, right? It's kind of misnamed. It's probably better called like the open as possible borders view. But like there's this
Right.
guy, he wrote an influential book, and he's kind of trying to say, like, look, I know this view seems super crazy, but I think it actually has a lot going for it, right? So I like teaching views like that, not because I necessarily always agree with them, but like sometimes it can be more profitable to argue with somebody who's kind of like outside the consensus of what we consider like the reasonable views, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a student was writing about that view, and when a view like that is like kind of like outside it's like kind of beyond genteel opinion, right? It's like not like the polite, respectable view that we're taught to have. students will sometimes like push back at them in kind of like a knee-jerk way, right?
Mhm.
I'm not here to say like, "Oh, you gotta like agree with the radical views or disagree." I'm like, just train yourself to analyze them carefully, right, as best you can.
Mm.
So sometimes students will push back in like a knee-jerk way. But I remember once a student was like talking to me about that view, and he was like, you know, without getting into the weeds, he was like, this guy's whole argument, he's trying to say in many ways that we should not have really nearly as much immigration control because I'm going to oversimplify now. Like the border between the US and Mexico, it should be like more like the border between California and Arizona. If we don't have checkpoints at one, we don't have checkpoints at the other, right?
Mhm.
So now there's lots we can say about that, right? But my student, I thought like, and sometimes people will make I find a point is good if you're like, once you hear it, you're kinda like, "Well, yeah, how could anybody think differently?" Right? Like, it seems
Right.
obvious. So my
Yeah.
student was like, "Yeah, but look, like, think about the road system between California and Arizona, right? It's not just that there's no border guards, right? The government plays a very active role in maintaining our ability to travel inside the boundaries of the United States, right? They'll pave the roads in places where it snows, they'll remove the snow if trees fall, right? So if this guy's serious, his analogy doesn't just entail like reducing the control at the border, it would actually entail like taking positive steps to encourage
Oh,
people
shit.
around the world to get here, right? The
Right.
analogy would be the equivalent of like the road that the government it's not just they don't have policemen on it, they actually kind of maintain it and encourage, and right?
Right.
And that's and now we're getting beyond radical to like super radical, right? So a student once pointed out to me and I was like, that's yeah, I see what you mean there, right? It happens
Right.
all the time.
Wow. Because I always think about that. 'Cause as a younger person who typically like I will try and challenge views because I'm curious by nature. So like I don't challenge views like, oh, that person's wrong. I'm like, why do you think that way?
Mm,
And normally you get put down because of it, because I'm 20 years old or whatever it might be. So I always find it interesting to look at the other way around. Someone that because like you're supposed to always look at either side of the thing because you're a philosopher. So I'm like, that's pretty interesting. And how did you come to your philosophical beliefs? Like, how did that kind of? I know like long career and stuff, but kind of like how did you? At least maybe the last couple of years, kind of,
mm,
if that makes sense.
mm. Okay, last couple of years. Okay, wow. I think it's a mix, right? So like one thing okay, so I've written a book on moral issues around animals, okay? And so I just signed up for this political philosophy class when I was an undergraduate, okay? And so, like in those days, I ate meat, I wore a leather jacket, I just had very mainstream views. But the professor, she included some of these animal rights readings on the syllabus, okay?
Mm,
And when she first presented the arguments, I was like, okay, this is not just wrong. Like these arguments are ridiculous, right? So me and her would just argue back and forth in the class. And eventually I just felt she had the better arguments. Okay. And so I did make some changes to like how I live and stuff based on that. Okay.
mm,
And now here I am, like, I'm embarrassed to say how many years later it is, but now I've written a book on those themes. I don't know if she would agree with everything I said, but my views are closer to hers than they are to like, my views back in those days, right? So sometimes philosophy has presented me with views that challenge my pre-existing views, right? And I've had to grapple with them and go over to them in that case,
mm,
or ask myself, like, can I in good conscience continue to reject this argument that I'm being presented with? Do I have actual grounds for thinking that? So that happens, right? So so sometimes that happens, right? But then there are other times where the value of philosophy hasn't been changing my conclusions, but it's helped me see that maybe like the basis for why I thought something was not a good reason and there's a better reason out there, right? And so it'll give me kind of like it'll help me if I can put it this way. It helps me kind of like systematize my views, see how the
mm,
reasons for this one do or don't go with this other one, and that can be kind of like clarifying, right? So it like, you know, maybe I'm just going through my life. I have all these kind of like very common views about fairness, right? But then I
mm,
read philosophy texts and it's like, hey, when you think about fairness, a lot of it has to do with some notion of impartiality. The idea that you and I, we kind of matter equally in some way, right?
mm,
I believe that, right? So,
yeah,
like, there, I was like, "Oh, yeah, like, impartiality is, like, a really important principle," right? That's doing something in my thinking, right? It's helping kind of illuminate how a
Mm,
lot of the stuff hangs together for me, and maybe in some cases, it will also influence my actual substantive views on a topic, but that illumination is separate and distinct from, "Andy, here's the right conclusion." So so that's part of, how philosophy has kind of influenced me. And then so I used to be a journalist, and one reason I like applied ethics and political philosophy is I have a lot of respect for metaethics and other, metaphysics and other areas of philosophy that can become quite abstract and removed from our day-to-day questions and way of life. But for me, I like it where philosophy really kind of does touch on real world stuff. So I think, for example, I might at some point write a book on academic freedom and free inquiry, and I because there's issues about that in the news all the time. And there's debates, right? And like, what is the right view of academic freedom? I don't want to say empirical questions have no bearing on that. But at the end of the day, that's like a moral judgment, right? Like, what are, this podcast, right? You're going around
mhm,
interviewing people about anything. Like in
yeah,
some countries, that might be illegal, right? You know what I mean? So it's like,
yeah,
there's like, but no, it's justified. Okay, why is it justified, right? Okay.
right,
I go in the classroom. I talk about obviously weird views like open
mhm,
borders and animal rights. But why is
right,
that justified? What are my responsibilities? But I don't like to pound students over the head with my view. You know what I mean? Like,
right,
so like
yeah,
all of that stuff is very connected to debates that are going on around us all the time. So partially for me, I'm interested if I mean, maybe this sounds a bit grandiose, and I hope I'm not deluded, but like trying to get at a deeper understanding of questions that are already kind of thrown in our face, whether we like them or not. And so in that way, I'm
mm.
influenced by stuff going on in the culture around me.
That's so, and I didn't really think about it that deep of what you can and can't teach and what you can and can't think of, and like that. I didn't really think about academic freedom like that, to be honest. Yeah,
I
because
mean, there's lots of controversies right now, right?
yeah,
So like, you know, so there's been a few professors who've been fired for their reactions to like Kirk's killing. Okay. There's been a few professors who've been fired for stuff they've said about transgender issues, right? And the list. Okay, so I've deliberately chosen like a right wing one and a left
yeah,
wing one. I'm
yeah,
not. I'm not trying to like, you
no,
know, yeah, right. So like, so that's like that stuff is happening, right? So like,
mm,
what you know, what
right,
should, I mean, I have like an extra interest in this, given that I'm a professor myself, right?
mm-hmm.
But I was interested in this kind of stuff back when I was a journalist. Sorry,
Oh, you're good.
and so especially when So, okay, this is actually a good example, I think, where how philosophy in particular helps, right? So, very often, say we're just talking about like some academic freedom or free speech controversy, right? For a lot of people, and there's a bit of this in me too, right? Our first impulse is to kind of like argue it out based on whether we think the controversial view in question is one we agree with or disagree with, right? You
Mm,
see that all the time up and down on social media, right?
mm-hmm.
So, like, if somebody, some professor gets disciplined for saying something that goes against the rights of trans people, conservatives will act on that, and vice versa, left-wing professors will act on that, right?
Right.
But like philosophy can help us see like, well, look, we need to go beyond like a one-off issue-driven discussion and try to think about what are the deeper principles that should apply,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it can't just be like people should be allowed to say things I agree with, right?
Right.
Like I couldn't run a class if that's what I thought, because I often assign readings that disagree with one another, right?
Right.
I think that can be productive, right? So like we're thrown into, I hope, an attempt to kind of get at like the deeper principles that could oblige me to say, no, I should stick up for this person's right to say something, even if it's something I disagree with. In some cases, something I might disagree with quite strongly.
Mm. Do you think that if we taught philosophy maybe at like a high school level and taught this way of thinking at least, like
Mm,
be able to go back and forth, and like you just said, I assign one paper that goes this way, then it goes against
mm.
this way, that it could almost help where we are in this current fear of not just politics,
Yeah,
but just things in general. With like,
that's a good question. So, uh, there are countries like France where they teach philosophy in the high schools. And I lived in Australia for 8 years, and there was a movement to make philosophy more commonly taught in the high schools there. So here in North America, it's very unusual for philosophy to be taught in the high schools. One, to my mind, very beneficial effect of doing that is that because it's not taught in the high schools, people sometimes they get like preconceptions or even stereotypes in their mind about philosophy, right?
Hmm.
So I think if people had more exposure, I think that would be valuable. Um, but human beings, we are not. It doesn't come naturally to us to reason calmly and carefully. We're
Right.
swayed by emotion and all sorts of things. So I could imagine a value of high school philosophy. I think there might be some areas of philosophy where we'd be better off to say, we're probably not gonna be able to do this one very well in high school,
Hmm.
like some of the more abstract, stuff, but like critical thinking classes, like we're like, look, here, these are fallacies. Here's how to
Hmm.
understand, surveys or like law, the nature of logic or ad hominems. Like that, I think could be very valuable. Yeah.
Okay. So when I think people think of someone that thinks for a living, I mean, they think of people maybe looking out a window or twirling a ball. Like, where do you go to think is what I'm trying to get at, I guess. Because like
Like in
a
terms of
lot of
physical spaces.
yeah, like what is like? Do you say I need to think and I go somewhere for your job because I'm coming to this because I think a lot of
Mm,
jobs, like, especially businesses, they won't allow you to go. If you said I got to go for a walk to go figure out this work problem, they would be like,
mm,
"What are you crazy?" But
mm.
I'm so interested in this way of because my best ideas for this podcast come on a drive or in the shower at the gym. So
Yeah, yeah,
I'm so
yeah,
interested in that how that
yeah.
works.
I'm exactly the same way. A drive, a shower, if I go for a run.
Hmm.
Um, for me, thinking and writing are very closely related. So if I'm writing something, I often won't write the introduction until I've done the rest of the article because it's really only ultimately in the process of writing the article that I know what I ultimately think about it. That's very common for me. Um, and then if I go for a run, if I'm working on something and I'm struggling with an argument or an idea, sometimes the run can be a valuable way to kind of like grind through the problem. The shower is an interesting one. You know, um, I remember seeing a talk by somebody. He was a professor and he was advising students to try to do academic work as early in the day as possible. And I thought he had an interesting theory. He said, everybody, it's like we have this like for lack of a better term, this kind of internal censorship, right? This impulse in us that makes sure that we don't just blurt out random stuff in an offensive way. But
Mm,
there's some evidence to suggest that it kind of like wakes up a bit later than we do. So there's a period in the mornings where we're kind of like creative, right? And
mm,
after I read that, I saw that I was like, oh, that would explain why I get so many ideas in the shower, right? Um, and it's a time of day thing. So that's not place, but that's like time of day. Um, Sometimes, if I go hear a paper, I'll have to be thinking in the audience, right?
mm,
But like a nice thing about philosophy is we don't need big labs. We don't need a
mm,
lot of equipment and, good ideas can come to us anywhere. That might be a mistake on the part of managers that they don't allow people wider access to physical spaces. I once worked at a mutual fund company where they had a quote quiet room where people could just go during the day, right? So maybe that
mm.
has extra value, precisely because of the reason you mentioned.
I think because like even like Albert Einstein would say that if he had a big problem, he'd go to bed or he'd go for a walk and then come
Mm,
back. And it's like if the smartest thinkers think that way, or, like why would we not kind of maneuver that way? You know what I mean? But
yeah. Um, I mean, if it's good enough for Einstein, I think it's
yeah,
going to be
right,
good for the rest of us, right? Like,
right. One last question because I know you gotta go. I've been asking everyone this question, my favorite question of all time. What's the best compliment you can receive, not physical?
uh, I mean, if yeah, I mean, we're getting just like a personal stuff. Like, yeah,
It can be work too. It can be like a student like said something like whatever. I like to see where people's brain goes because I try and there's a reason why I asked this question, so I have to try
mm.
and just
Okay. So like, okay. So if I'm thinking like in terms of with my like philosophy professor hat on, um, there is a real emphasis in philosophy on trying to be clear. Okay.
hmm
So when people like reviewers or whatnot have said that something is very clearly written, I I do get a little bit of extra value out of that because you can exaggerate the relationship, but I think clarity of thought is most often enhanced by clarity of expression. So I
Mm,
value that. Um, I teach a lot of stuff, as you can tell from my examples, like immigration and animals. I teach a lot of stuff that does involve hot button controversies of one kind or another.
mm-hmm,
But when students say that we've managed to have those kinds of discussions in a way that it didn't feel like I was clobbering them over the head with my own view, but
mm-hmm.
was rather trying to create a space where we could kind of deliberate at a deeper level, I get a lot of value out of that as well. Okay, now we're getting like very vain now, but somebody wrote something recently about stuff I'd written and they said it was brave, right? And I was like, well, you know how to butter me up. Thank you.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, I appreciate it, Professor. It was a great conversation. Definitely one of my favorite conversations I've had. Happy we
Awesome.
did
Great.
this.
Great.
Yeah. If you ever
Okay.
want to come back again, I'd love to have you.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So, I'll be maybe you can let me know, when it goes up.
Yeah, definitely. It's gonna be up about 2 weeks.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Okay, well, thanks for your questions, Don, and have a
of
good one.
course. Thank you. You too.
Cheers.